At exactly 05:45 on May 26, 2025, a Ukrainian Air Force pilot strapped himself into the cockpit of a MiG-29 fighter jet, preparing for a mission unlike any the Soviet-designed aircraft had ever flown. The 40-year-old warplane, never intended to carry the Western weaponry now bolted to its wings, was moments away from launching a daring attack against one of Russia's most protected institutions. Its payload consisted of French precision-guided bombs, powered by American GPS, directed by Ukrainian software, and literally held together with zip ties and hope. As the pilot taxied down the runway, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. No one had ever struck an FSB facility during this war. Russia's internal security agency, the successor to the KGB, was supposed to be untouchable, protected not just by layers of physical defenses, but by the understanding that some targets were simply off-limits. That understanding was about to be shattered. The mission plan was insane, even by Ukrainian standards. The pilot would have to fly at treetop level to stay under radar detection, then suddenly climb to 5,000 meters to release his bombs, a move that would light him up on Russian radar like a Christmas tree. He'd have about 20 seconds to release the weapons and dive back to low altitude before Russian surface-to-air missiles could respond. At 05:58, the pilot pushed the throttles forward. The two Klimov RD-33 turbofans roared to life, generating 18,000 pounds of thrust. The MiG-29 leapt down the runway, its Frankenstein payload along for the ride. French bombs, American satellites, and Ukrainian ingenuity, all aimed at the heart of Russian state security. By 06:15, the MiG was screaming across the Ukrainian countryside at just 50 meters above the ground, so low that its jet wash bent wheat fields and scattered birds in panic. The pilot worked the controls constantly, dodging power lines, cell phone towers, and the occasional farmhouse. The margins for error were razor-thin. Russian S-400 air defense systems, capable of hitting targets 400 km away, dominated the border. But at such a low altitude, the Earth's curvature gave the pilot some protection. Russian radar couldn't see past about 25 km. As long as he stayed low and fast, he remained invisible. But in just 3 minutes, he'd have to abandon that stealth and climb into open sky for the weapon's release. The target, glowing on an actual iPad duct taped to the cockpit panel, was the Federal Security Service, FSB, headquarters in Glovo-Belgrade Oblast, just 5 miles from the border. This was no ordinary strike. The FSB was Vladimir Putin's old agency, responsible for orchestrating countless operations against Ukraine. The two AASM Hammer bombs on the MiG's wings embodied everything both absurd and brilliant about the mission. These French-made weapons were never meant to be compatible with 1980s Soviet avionics. The MiG-29 couldn't even process GPS data, let alone communicate with high-tech Western munitions. Ukrainian engineers had bridged that gap with battlefield improvisation, custom pylons made in Kyiv workshops, GPS antennas bolted on, power cables routed through panels never meant to be opened. The bombs, meanwhile, were masterpieces of French engineering. Dumb munitions turned into precision-guided weapons using inertial navigation and GPS, with rocket motors that kicked in after release to drive them at near-supersonic speeds. But all that tech meant nothing if the bombs didn't know where to go. That's where the iPad came in, running custom Ukrainian software that translated modern targeting data into signals the bombs could understand. It was, quite literally, a digital form of duct tape. At 06:22, the pilot reached the initial point and pulled the stick back hard. The MiG-29 climbed steeply, the nose pitching up to 45 degrees. G-forces crushed him into his seat as the altimeter spun. 1,000 meters, 2,000, 3,000. His radar warning receiver exploded in noise as Russian systems locked onto him. The S-400 battery southeast of Belgrade began painting him with its gravestone radar. In seconds, Russian fire control would have a firing solution, but the pilot's advantage was surprise. Russian air defenses were optimized for traditional attacks, not a suicidal climb followed by a toss-bombing maneuver from a decades-old jet. At 5,000 meters, the iPad displayed optimal launch parameters. The pilot pressed the weapon release. Two thuds shook the airframe as the AASM bombs dropped away. Instantly, the pilot rolled the MiG inverted and dove, pulling into a modified Immelman turn, bleeding altitude to regain speed and duck back under radar. Behind him, the bombs ignited their rocket motors and surged forward along their programmed trajectory. Their guidance systems, military GPS backed up by inertial navigation, began making hundreds of tiny corrections per second to keep them on track. The toss bombing technique he just executed was a Cold War relic, developed for nuclear bombers to drop gravity bombs without flying directly over the target. It was insane to attempt it today, unless it worked. Russia's response was fast but ineffective. Two 48N6 interceptor missiles launched from the S-400 system, but the MiG was already back at low altitude, maneuvering aggressively. The missiles, built to kill high-flying bombers, couldn't follow a jet that was hugging the Earth. They screamed overhead and detonated harmlessly in empty air. Meanwhile, the bombs flew on, just minutes from impact. The FSB officers at Glovo had no idea that death was streaking toward them through the morning sky. Guided by satellites they couldn't jam and technology they didn't understand. Inside the building, the explosion's pressure waves rebounded off walls and floors, multiplying force through a phenomenon called reflected overpressure. The resulting shockwave devastated everything in its path. Windows didn't just shatter, they exploded outward, launching glass shards hundreds of meters. Office chairs and filing cabinets became deadly projectiles. Classified documents rained down like confetti. Then 0.3 seconds later, the second bomb struck. The building was already structurally compromised. Load-bearing walls had collapsed and support columns were cracked. The second detonation caused a progressive collapse. Floor by floor, the FSB headquarters imploded. The fourth floor pancaked onto the third. The fifth followed, each falling level adding mass and energy, accelerating the building's self-destruction. Within 5 seconds, the once imposing 5-story headquarters of the Russian FSB had become a burning heap of rubble and state secrets. The strike didn't just destroy a building. It shattered the illusion of invulnerability that had protected Russia's security apparatus for decades.